Good afternoon. I'm Randall Pike from the Department of Television Resources and Web Services. Welcome to the Board of Education Board meeting for Thursday, March 10, 2011. This board meeting will begin with a news break going to the head of the AP class. The legislative agenda will focus on bill status chart, State Bill 628, health retirement benefits, public employees and retirees, and State Bill 683, Equity and Education Funding Act of 2011. Under the budget consent agenda, the board will discuss Parkdale High School addition, final payment, Doswell Brooks Elementary School CMR section, FY06 Potomac High School final payment closeout, FY11 Parkdale High School 3 science room design build, FY11 Marlton Elementary School pod design build, Stephen Decatur Middle School 2 pod design build, FY11 William Beans 4 pod design build, FY11 Friendly High School 3 science room design build, and FY11 Laurel High School change order numbers 85 through 89, and the repurposed surplus facilities for use of charter schools. Under emergency item, the board will review refreshing the local area network infrastructures and our 80% and 90% E-rate discounted schools action. And now the March 10th Board of Education meeting will begin.
Thank you. Good afternoon and welcome to the March 10, 2011 meeting of the Prince George's County Board of Education. As we begin, please turn off your wireless communications as they tend to interfere with the taping of the meeting. At this time, I would ask Ms. Beck if she will lead us in the board prayer and the Pledge of Allegiance.
O God, we pray to administer that which is just in all educational policies, being ever mindful of your guidance, stir us to action with love, wisdom, and understanding. Amen. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, in liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Ms. Beck. Colleagues, the topic for today's board meeting is that of student achievement. Mr. Vaughn, call the roll, please.
Mr. Armwood.
Present.
Ms. Boston. Present. Mr. Burrows.
Present.
Ms. Eubanks.
Yeah.
Ms. Higgins.
Here.
Ms. Johnson.
Present.
Ms. Waller.
Present.
Mr. Harris.
Present.
Mrs. Beck.
Present.
Mrs. Jacobs.
Here. Thank you. Colleagues, prior to adoption of the agenda, we have one change. 8.1 has been added as an emergency item. And prior to accepting a motion with regard to the minutes, the Chair recognizes Ms. Beck.
Both sets of minutes were accurate but needed clarification in terms of the days that were available for media specialists. There was clarification after the meeting that a .2 was not 2 days a week, that it was 1 day a week. And so both sets of minutes have a clarifier that the minutes were accurate, but that information received after the meetings updated the minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Beck. Can I have a motion? Thank you, Mr. Harris and Ms. Waller, for the motion to approve the board meeting minutes for for the agenda for March 10, 2011. Any discussion? Seeing none, all in favor? Aye. Any objections or abstentions? Motion passed. Colleagues, on approval of the minutes for February 19th budget work session and February 24th board meeting. May I have a motion, please?
Move as amended.
Thank you, Ms. Beck. Thank you, Ms. Wallace. It's been properly moved and seconded that the Board of Education approve the meeting minutes for February 19th budget work session and the February 24th board meeting. Any discussion? Seeing none, all in favor? Aye. Any objections or abstentions? Thank you. Motion passed. We have a news break which is entitled Going to the Head of the AP Class at this time.
This is a Prince George's County Public Schools news break.
I'm taking AP Physics because I feel that it'll help me because I'm planning to become an aerospace engineer. And by taking this class in high school, I feel like I can get a step ahead from other people that are going into college. And this class is really rigorous and I'm learning a lot. And it interests me, so why not take it?
Dustin Goulian's enthusiasm for taking AP Physics at Eleanor Roosevelt High School, my alma mater, was a common sentiment recently as the Greenbow School was proclaimed one of the top advanced placement schools in the country. At a press conference organized by the College Board to release the 7th annual AP report to the nation, Maryland was announced for the 3rd year in a row as a state having the highest percentage of its students receiving a grade of 3 or higher on the AP and the largest increase in performance by African American students. And of the 2 Maryland schools receiving special mention for exemplary AP programs, one was Prince George's own Eleanor Roosevelt.
This is a celebration and a recognition of the work that you've done in your state. But that doesn't seem to be, that you're number one doesn't seem to be what is important. What seems to be important in this state is that you're not satisfied with being number one.
Of course, the secret to getting to the head of the AP class and staying there is no secret at all. Careful planning, hard work, committed teachers, and a culture of excellence have long been the guiding principles of the locally known Roosevelt Way.
We have a writing program. Schools define themselves. Some schools in English are grammar, some are reading. We are a writing school. And the AP is 3 writing essays. So when we get good scores like this, it's not just the AP teachers that take credit for it and pride in it. It's the whole department because everyone's an AP teacher or a pre-AP teacher. And most schools don't do that.
My students who are seniors, they've had chemistry, physics, and a lot of other biology classes. So I have to focus on hitting the prior knowledge and then how can I expand it and make sure that I cover the AP curriculum but not just worry about the test.
It's just all hard work. I mean, you have to keep on practicing and studying and, take time every day. Just, keep on working hard at it, and if you're not doing well, ask for help.
Stay committed
to
the class and keep going even if it's hard right now, but you'll get through it.
That the Roosevelt Scholars, many of whom take 3 or more AP classes, are as highly regarded as the school's other standout students is another reason why AP thrives at Eleanor Roosevelt.
Being a good student is just as great as being a great athlete here. People are definitely rewarded for great grades, and students here are very competitive between each other, and they keep each other motivated to do better.
With more and more of Prince George's African American students taking the AP exam, being 1/3 of last year's state total, and with more scoring 3 or higher and thus qualifying for college credit, the state superintendent is counting on them to use peer pressure to get wavering students to make the jump to advanced placement. Call them AP ambassadors, if you will.
They're our best PR people, the students themselves, and they have a credibility with their peers. So I want all of them to be ambassadors.
With dreams of great careers, Roosevelt students know their school and teachers have planned their AP courses carefully to ensure those dreams become reality.
Give your education a grade. You feel prepared for college?
I definitely do. I would give it an A. I've been able to take, in the past I've taken AP Biology, AP Chemistry. This year I'm taking Genetics, Microbiology, and Anatomy and Physiology. So I feel well prepared to go into medicine and just continue that field.
For Telly Award-winning TV 96 on Comcast and 38 on Verizon, and reporter Dave Zarin, this is student reporter Savon Ayodeji.
Congratulations to our students who are accepting the challenge of rigorous coursework, and not only accepting it, succeeding at it. This month is designated as National Women's History Month, the observance of a special period for focusing on contributions of women highlights noteworthy women who have played defining roles in shaping our nation and the thousands of American women who are continuing to further the cause of freedom and social change through service in government, the military, and other organizations. The theme of this 2011 observance of National Women's History Month is Our History is Our Strength. All schools are asked to plan special activities in observance of National Women's History Month this March. In observance of National Women's History Month, I would also like to share a part of history with you. On this day, March 10, 1913, the woman known as Moses died in Auburn, New York. In her lifetime, Harriet Tubman completed more than a dozen Underground Railroad journeys, largely on foot, battling harsh winters, and Tubman lived to be 83, quite a feat for a woman with a bounty on her head for slave stealing. Kudos for students. Congratulations to Northwestern High School's forensics team as they placed 7th out of 90 schools in the WACFL competition on Saturday, February 12th. They're placing them in the top 10. These students have qualified for the Metro Championship on March 12th, which is a chance to advance to the National Championship in D.C. in May. I would also like to congratulate the 58 teams from 20 public schools in Prince George's County who will get a chance to show off their creative minds at the Designation Imagination Regional Tournament. Designation Imagination is a community-based, school-friendly program where teams of 5 to 7 members work together and learn to apply what they know and what they are good at to solve challenges, work together cooperatively as a team, and push the limits of imagination to better themselves. Art by 4 Prince George's County students who won in the recent 3rd Annual Maryland Statewide High School Juried Art Show will be displayed in 2 upcoming exhibitions. The show's theme this year is Women Leaders Who Have Affected Communities, and the Freedom Sisters exhibition includes works by young artists from Anne Arundel, Baltimore, Carroll, Frederick, and Prince George's counties, as well as Baltimore City. Of 45 entries submitted, 20 finalist pieces were selected to be featured in the show. The work will be displayed from March the 9th to April 1st at the Maryland State Department of Education in Baltimore, and also from April the 6th to May 13th at the Maryland State Education Association in Annapolis. In the Prince George's County Science Bowl semifinal elimination rounds on March 2nd, teams from Scotchtown Hills Elementary and Rogers Heights Elementary fired off answers to questions about Charles Darwin being the ambidextrous and the sassafras plant that helps make root beer. They can help me on today. In the first round, Laurel Scotchtown Hills Elementary defeated Blainsburg Rogers Heights Elementary School 245 to 165. Scotchtown Hills defeated Bond Mill 300 to 155 in the 3rd and final game. And the Science Bowl, hosted by Dave Zarin, of course, is a televised quiz bowl for the Prince George's County Public Elementary and Middle School students. Students compete in 2 teams of 3 to test their science knowledge from current science news to planetary facts and medical conditions. Kudos to our teachers. We have Claudette Clark, a mathematics teacher at Dwight D. Eisenhower Middle School, was recently selected as a recipient of the 2011 Krista McAuliffe Outstanding Teacher Award. During her 16-year career serving students in our school district, Clark has spent the last 5 years teaching math to 8th graders at Dwight D. Eisenhower Middle School. Peers at the school nominated Clark for the award based on her ability to motivate students, as well as her content knowledge and communication skills. Her community involvement and professional training were also contributions as well. Please join me in a moment of silence for Sherry Marsh, a guidance counselor at Isaac Gordine Middle School. Thank you for that moment of silence. Please remember to keep the family of Sherry Marsh in your prayers. And Dr. Height, I yield to you for Superintendent's Report.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good afternoon, everyone. I would like to open by saying thank you to students and staff in grades 3, 5, and 8 who worked so hard to make the administration of the Maryland School Assessments in Reading a success this week. To our students, I appreciate all of your hard work in preparation for the 2-day assessments and your efforts to do your best. To our teachers and school administrators, thank you for all the extra work that it takes to ensure these test administrations run smoothly, and for planning special events and activities to prepare and incentivize students. To our parents and family members, you have also played a critical role in ensuring that students were rested, on time, and prepared to do their best on these assessments. Next week, from March 15th to 16th, we will be administering the MSA in mathematics, and I know our students will continue to make us proud. If you had the opportunity to tune in to Channel 5 or Channel 7 News last night, you probably saw the story on what Oxon Hill High School students are doing to discourage bullying in their school. Both media outlets interviewed students this week and featured news reports on the student-initiated One Less Bully, One More Friend campaign. Students interviewed for the reports had the chance to share their story about the program at Oxon Hill and connect their efforts with the anti-bullying message sent out by President and First Lady Obama. Congratulations to all of the students and the staff at Oxon Hill for their outstanding efforts. Congratulations also to Akila Brown, 6th grade tag student at Oakcrest Elementary School, who is a 2011 Maryland State finalist in the Letters About Literature contest. Letters About Literature is the signature program of the Library of Congress Center for the Book. To participate, students write to an author of a book that has somehow changed their lives. And Akila wrote her letter to Lauren McHale, author of Love Ya Bunches. Akila will be recognized during a ceremony at the Enoch Pratt Library in Baltimore, and the Maryland winners selected to compete at the national level will be announced after March 15th. Congratulations to Salem Johnson, teacher at Parkdale High School, who was recently selected by the Network for Teaching Entrepreneurship as the D.C. Region Rookie Teacher of the Year. So Johnson will be recognized at the NFTE DC Dare to Dream Gala on April 27th at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in Washington, D.C. Do you know an outstanding teacher at your school who could be the next Maryland Teacher of the Year? The Office of Communication is currently accepting nominations for this year's award through March 25th. A Prince George's County Teacher of the Year will go on to compete for the state honor and possibly for the national award. For nomination criteria and detailed information, visit our school system's website. Together with the Prince George's County Chamber of Commerce, we're hosting the 2011 Principal for a Day event on April 7th. If you're a business representative and are interested in supporting a school in Prince George's County, we encourage you to take part. Visit the school system website to learn more. Business partnerships are more important than ever before and provide students with unique opportunities and experiences. As we continue through the FY 2012 budget process, I'm proud to report that our community has made a tremendous effort to rally together for students, showing their support for public education. Thank you to all of our parents, families, community members, employers, and employees who have participated in this year's budget process. We know your voice is being heard in Annapolis, and we are proud of your efforts. Many of our elected officials have contacted us to let us know that they have heard your concerns and are working hard to ensure that our students in Prince George's County continue to receive the funding they need in order to achieve. Please be sure to check the school system's website frequently for the latest information on the FY 2012 budget. Madam Chair, that concludes my comments.
Thank you, Dr. Height. Colleagues, at this point, we will go into public comment on items for which the board will take action. We have one registered speaker, Mr. David L. Kahn. Mr. Kahn, you may come forward to speak on the topic of the revised board policy 9360. Oh, but we're not at that point yet. Go ahead anyway.
Okay, I thought this was going to come up when that agenda thing. If you want me to do it now, I'm happy to.
I'm so used to you being here, Mr. Kahn. It was natural, so go right ahead.
Okay. Thank you. There are several good things in your revision of the meetings policy and several things where I think you've made it worse, particularly with respect to the consent agenda, where there are two things. Several ambiguities that have existed in the past still exist, particularly with respect to what happens when a member does object and an item is supposed to be treated as a first reader. The meaning of that is not clear, and I'll be writing the board to suggest some language that makes it clear. One board member cannot adopt on behalf of the board an item and pass it merely by objecting to it being on the consent agenda, to pass it on first reader. It becomes a first reader and needs action by the board on the first reader agenda item and needs to be passed on first reading, and that's not clear. But what you've really done, though, is totally expand the consent agenda to include almost anything. It previously had been just ministerial items and the usual things about budget changes and change orders and things like that. You've added two more things, basically. One is items that have previously been presented to the board for review and discussion at prior board meeting. This is very bad. Just because something was discussed, it had not been reduced to an actual form that the public can consider and comment on. To bring it up on the consent agenda denies the public the two bites at the apple. The first bite when you are presenting it on first reader, where the public can weigh in as to how it should be changed, and the second bite when it's coming up for real approval. So just because it's been discussed is meaningless. Secondly, you add agenda items presented for discussion at a system oversight meeting or a CIP or FAB committee. Again, it's just discussion. That means anything can slide in under that just because you've discussed it at a previous meeting. And it's not limited to your ministerial and housekeeping measures that normally are on the consent agenda. That's my biggest problem with this, and as I say, I'll be writing the board about it. In addition, your system oversight meetings are really not very different from your regular meetings, and they are board meetings. To say they're not board meetings, then you couldn't adopt anything. You couldn't have any of these procedures on there. They are board meetings, and really they're a distinction without a difference. I will communicate with the board on other technical and policy problems, and I hope that you'll consider my recommendations, and perhaps when this comes back, some of them might be included. Anyhow, thank you for at least dealing with the topic.
Thank you, Mr. Khan. I think in our discussion today, we may be able to get some of those issues clarified as well. Colleagues, at this time, I will ask Mr. Lucci if he would come forward with the legislative update. We do not have any public comment with regard to that agenda item.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair, members of the Board of Education. The Maryland General Assembly 2011 session is about to enter its third trimester. That is when all the activity will take place. Next week, the Appropriations Committee will be making decisions on the budget, making a final recommendation by Friday. The following week, the budget will be in the floor of the House. The week after that, it'll be over into the Senate, and decisions will be made there. And so very important decisions with regard to funding of public education will be made next week, the week after that. And so all of the calls and emails and letters that have been coming from the Prince George's County Public Schools community to folks in Annapolis have been very, very effective. And all I can say is keep those cards and letters coming. You have before you today two pieces of legislation on the agenda. The first one, SB 628, State Health Retirement Benefits, Public Employees and Retirees, is a very, very significant issue. It does a lot of things with regard to the state pension plan. But the most important thing is that it puts on the County Board of Education eventually half of the responsibility for funding educator pensions. And you remember when the session started, the governor said, we're not going to do this year. We need to look at this very carefully, and perhaps in the future we'll do it, but not this year. And then Senator Miller put in this bill, and people said, this bill is just to kind of put people on notice, but we're not going to do it this year. Since then, and very recently, budget folks from the House and the Senate are now very seriously looking at starting the ball rolling with regard to shifting state teacher pension obligations to not the county government, but to the County Board of Education. And under Senator Miller's bill for fiscal year 2012 will be an extra $7.6 million obligation for the board. Fiscal year 2013, $19.8 million. Fiscal year 2014, $30.5 million. Fiscal year 2015, $31.1 million. Now, the discussions among the House and Senate budget leaders does not include such a fast ramp-up. Nonetheless, it is the foot in the door, the nose under the tent, all the proverbial expressions that would lead us to this kind of a huge obligation when, in fact, it's the Constitution that places the burden of funding of adequate public education on the state. And so that's a long-winded way of recommending that this board oppose Senate Bill 628.
Thank you, Mr. Lucci. As I was reading this, it's pretty extensive, but there was a question that I actually asked the chair of the delegation, and she wasn't really sure. And I think it is a foregone conclusion that this is going to happen at some point, and I think we've, year after year, I'm not saying we support it, but there's a reality. One of the things that I didn't see, and it could just be that, it's a legal document and I just got too crazy about it, but if you're going to shift pension to the locals, and particularly if you're going to shift it to the local Board of Education, my question was, what authority, is it automatic, or do you have to have in legislation that you then also have authority around whether it's employee contributions and those kinds of things? Do you know whether that's even been discussed as part of this process of shifting pension to local school boards?
That part I don't think has been discussed. What has been discussed is right now the locals only have 2 of the 15 seats on the pension board, and I think none of the seats on the investment committee. And so if you're going to shift more of the obligation to the locals, you should also shift some of the authority to the locals as well, and that's being discussed of how to engineer that, and then that could drive the other factors that you discussed.
So if something like this were to happen, maybe it wouldn't happen this year, or if it does, and we're not responsible necessarily for the payout for FY 2012, will we have to go back, in your opinion, to have it legislated to add that the local boards would then have more authority around negotiating employee contributions?
Yes, I mean I'm strongly encouraging everybody to, if they really feel like they have to put it in the legislation this year, to put that local authority in the same time, although we're be objecting to any kind of movement. But you're right, if that doesn't happen and there is a year leeway, then I think we need to work with MABE and very strong legislation to give much more local authority over investment decisions and other decisions that a pension board makes.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Higgins, Ms. Johnson, and Mr. Harris.
Excuse me if I'm missing something, but we have no independent sources of revenue. So if we're going to be obligated to handle this, aren't we going to get the money from the state anyway?
No more than, it would not change the formula, so we wouldn't get any more than we otherwise would.
Am I missing something here?
And I don't think you're missing it. It's just that we would have to, whatever our normal, we would have to use it out of our regular operating funds, or, yeah.
I mean, I do think there is a constitutionality issue with regard to this when the Constitution says it's a state's obligation to provide an adequate public education, and certainly paying a teacher's pensions is part of providing that education. You're providing the teacher into the classroom with a pension to educate the children. So, I do think that there is some question about that.
Ms. Johnson and Mr. Harris.
Mr. Lucci, let's say if this would pass, what I'd like to know is what is the splits between the state and the county in the contribution for that, and is there a cap? And then my next question about that is, if this would happen and there's the split, the state, the county, what's the state going to do with the savings? Is there going to be provision for turning around what the state is not contributing rather than just amassing just some great amount of resources? Is it going to be passed along in some significant way back to the counties?
To answer
I realize this is a don't know the answer, but what do you believe?
I think I know the answer. To answer your first question, 20 years ago, the obligation of paying for Social Security payments was shifted from the state to the county. And so what you would do to calculate this is add in the Social Security and the pension together, and the county and the state would each have to pay 50% of that, ultimately, once it's ramped up to the 2015 level, giving the county credit for paying the Social Security. With regard to any kind of rechanneling the savings back into public education, I can tell you there's no intention of doing that. The state argues that its obligation for paying pensions has increased by 80% in the past 4 or 5 years, and therefore the money is needed to help fill the fiscal hole that they say that they're left with. So there's certainly no discussion, no intention, nothing about rechanneling that money back into public education.
But with that thought, the reality is at some point there is going to be created a surplus, because the money is going to, we're not going to be in this hole forever. And you're going to get an amassing of savings if this were to pass, particularly if there's not going to be a cap that could be minimized over time as the savings or contribution or change in lifestyle so that you don't have as much usage, whatever happens. The what-ifs here are great.
Right. There's definitely no cap.
And if the county is going to, if we're going to be kicking in for benefits that we pay, and yet we're not going to receive anything from the state toward public education because they're being saved from this, we're the losers all the way around.
Right. I mean, that's why the message has to be from the public to Annapolis. One, don't reduce the amount of money we're receiving, but two, don't shift education obligations from the state to the county. I mean, it's got to be both aspects that has to be brought out.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. But just quickly, to her point, the pension is always driven by the salaries. I mean, that's one of the reasons the state is complaining, is because they say they have no control over our abilities to increase, to provide COLAs and cost of living, and that's what drives the cost.
Right.
Okay. Mr. Harris and then Mr. Armwood.
Actually, the question, I think, is for Dr. Height, or Mr. Lucci, if you know you can answer this. So when the pensions, if the pensions do come back to the county, it will come out of our operating budget. What money will it come out of?
Well, the board would have to decide, what more carnage it would have to impose to pay for it.
So, and if it is an operating budget, we already are paying, I think 80% of our operating budget just goes towards salaries.
So Mr. Harris would be our general operating fund. Yeah,
I can't support it.
Right.
Mr. Armwood.
Mr. Lucci, you mentioned that there was a constitutional question as to whether or not this bill was had problems constitutionally. Would we individually as a board or with MABE be in a position to challenge this bill and the imposition of the funding on the court? Because they're literally stealing from our children.
Right. I mean, your counsel may want to supplement my remarks, but one legal difficulty is that the board is a creature of the state. It was created by the state, and so for the board to sue the state would be like suing itself. But I think there are a lot of very interested potential plaintiffs. Sort of there were in the 90s when they sued the Baltimore City system and the state for not adequately funding Baltimore City schools. And there are organizations, but the board itself, I think there might be some legal impediment towards being the plaintiff.
Who would have standing to sue in the event of this?
Well, parents of students.
Mr. Armwood, I was involved in the Baltimore City school finance litigation, and what we did was the ACLU, parents of students enrolled in the system, and other taxpayers joined together as plaintiffs, and then the Board of Education for Baltimore City came in as an amicus and filed as a friend of the court what the positions were, and then that's how the city-state partnership legislation and the funding for Baltimore City came to be. So if that was the case, and I'm sure it would be, and I agree with Mr. Lucci, it would probably be more of a statewide initiative looking at all of the counties, local county boards being impacted, and MABE.
Is it a reasonable strategy for us to already start talking about that so they're on notice that we're looking at that strategy, and we may very well go that route to sue if they impose that upon us?
I think that type of general discussion would be helpful during this debate in Annapolis, yes.
How can we get that to move forward?
Well, through some of the organizations that have gathered together to support our schools that have already, been helping out. They have their networks. One more aspect of this I didn't mention, and that is this summer they had a commission to look into this issue, and when it made its recommendations about shifting the pension obligation, it said there should be a wealth equalization factor so that less wealthy jurisdictions don't take the hit as much as wealthier jurisdictions. That would save Prince George's County schools about $10 million a year. That's not being seriously considered by the legislature because of the negative impact it would have on Montgomery County. And so, although it seems like it's the right thing to do, and every other education formula in the state, in fact, every other formula in the state has some kind of wealth equalization factor to it, it's not being considered for this, and I think that's something else that needs to be brought out.
Thank you. Mr. Burrows?
Mr. Lucci, you know when the vote will be taken on this?
Well, the vote will be taken by the House Appropriations Committee a week from tomorrow, and then the vote will be on the floor of the House of Delegates the following week.
When it comes to the Senate, can you just let us know when it would be appropriate to contact our elected officials to ask them to vote no?
It's appropriate to contact them now.
Okay. Thank you. And my point in buzzing in was just to formally rise in opposition of this. $30 million is pre-K, reading recovery, specialty school transportation, and Camp Schmidt. And we simply cannot afford that. And I agree with Ms. Armwood. It's something that we absolutely cannot do, and I just wanted to formally come in strong opposition against it.
Mr. Harris, can I have a motion, please?
Yes, I move to oppose this bill.
Senate Bill 628, you mean?
Senate Bill 628. Thank you.
Is there a second? It's been properly moved and second that the board oppose Senate Bill 628. Any further discussion? Seeing none. Ms. Well, I probably don't need that. All in favor? Aye. Any objections or abstentions? Seeing none, motion passed. Thank you, Mr. Lucci. Next bill.
The other bill before you is the Equity in Education Funding Act of 2011. The House version had a hearing yesterday, and 5 of you came to show your support and represent your colleagues in support of this legislation. And we had a very, very good hearing. Ms. Johnson brought 2 students from the Northwestern Evening School who did a tremendous job of explaining to the legislators the benefits of evening school and how they want that to be continued. There were some great reading recovery teachers that testified there. It was just a very, very good hearing. The Senate version, very interestingly enough, originally was scheduled for a hearing on March 23rd, and that hearing was moved up to March 17th, which is a very unusual thing to happen, and I take that as a good sign. And so this is more for informational purposes, that March 17th before the Senate Budget and Taxation Committee at 1 p.m. It'll be good if we get a good showing there as well. Because the net taxable income is part of the whole big picture being considered by the budget folks right now with regard to making up the lost state aid and with regard to the state pensions. It's all one big thing, and so the stronger support, the stronger the support we can show for this legislation on the Senate side as well, the better. And so I just, as an informational item, I wanted to present that to you.
Thank you. I think we've debated this particular topic. Ms. Johnson.
Very quickly, Mr. Lucci, there was a very brief discussion yesterday at the hearing at which the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee engaged the manager of the bill, which is Delegate Ross, about holding Montgomery County harmless. Is that, you want to do a brief explanation? Is that solely for the period from when the bill, let's say it passed and was enacted, to 2012 or 13, is the window for the, is that what she's discussing? The
Yes.
harmless period, so that what they're going to get prior to that, they don't have to pay back?
It goes beyond that. The way the bill is written, they would be held harmless in perpetuity. Now,
Okay.
of course, any future legislature can always take that part out and then be having to pay again. So, I mean, you know, the legislation is only as good as it is for, you know, until the legislature meets again. But the way it's written right now, it would always be held harmless.
Okay.
For all future payments.
Right, except the way that it is currently being calculated, there is a disadvantage still to us. Was it, they mentioned Wycomico County? I'm not at all sure where the manager is and our delegation is on whether or not there is going to be acquiescence to that particular position. Do you know?
Well, I mean, the way all 23 delegates have signed on to the bill to hold Montgomery harmless. Now, someone has to pay, and so the way the bill is written, the state would have to pay about $30 million, and Prince George's County would receive about a third of that, like $9.6 million.
And then it would be distributed incrementally to those others that have been diminished by the calculation?
20 of the 24 jurisdictions would benefit. Washington County would be a huge amount for Washington County.
$2 million?
Right.
Yeah. Thank you.
Sure.
Colleagues, I entertain a motion, please. Don't all motion at once. I need a motion to support.
Support SB 683.
I make a motion that we support HR. What is the bill?
It's the Senate side, right?
SB
Yeah.
683.
I'm sorry, we did do that, we know we did the House side, but just to be on clear. 683, Senate bill.
683, Senate bill.
Thank you, Ms. Weston. It's been properly moved and second that we support the Senate version of the net taxable income fix for Prince George's County. All in favor? Any objections or abstentions? Seeing none, motion passed. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Colleagues, that concludes the legislative update. Dr. Height?
Thank you, Madam Chair. One discussion item today is an academic update, and this is designed around the academic updates for system oversight. And our academic update today will include some data, some performance data of our schools, particularly looking at our formative assessments. And walking us through this presentation today is our Chief Academic Officer, Dr. Arbogast. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Arbogast.
Good afternoon. We're going to be looking at FAST-2 data, which was actually derived in January, and all the presentation is really around FAST-2 from January 2011 compared to 2010. And I wanted to talk a little bit first, before we get into it, about what FAST data is and what it isn't. FAST data is written based on the voluntary state curriculum on the assessment limits. So what the students will be taking in this mirror where students should be on MSA. What we have found is FAST-2 is more closely correlated to actual MSA scores than FAST-1. This should not be surprising for a couple of reasons. One is it's actually administered much closer to the time of MSA, so it makes sense that the closer the test is to the state test, the more closely correlated it would be. Second important issue is if FAST 1 is implemented in October and students do poorly on any standards, that actually gives teachers opportunities to reteach. So what we want is you want an increase from FAST 1 to FAST 2. I did not include FAST 1 to FAST 2 data, but for the most part, scores did go up from FAST 1 to FAST 2. But we're really going to take kind of a close look at FAST 2. Now, let me tell you what this isn't. This isn't a mock MSA test, but it is correlated. On MSA, there are different difficulty levels of items, and each item is assigned a scale score. So the more difficult the item, the more scaled score points. That is not how FAST 2 is scored. FAST 2 is basically scored right, wrong. So when you look up here at proficient and advanced, you're really looking at probably more a measure of precision than you are at rigor. So FAST 2 has been written at the proficient level, so when you see advanced, that simply means these kids scored more items correctly. It's not necessarily a measure of rigor. What we've done, I've asked the testing department to do, is actually start embedding more rigorous items for the FAST exams for next year, so that we can actually start breaking out items that show a more rigorous instruction. So I also color-coded the presentation. A red score is a drop from 2010 to 2011. A blue score is an increase, and a green score is an increase of more than 5 points. Why 5 points? 5 points is a pretty significant bump in a score. It's actually kind of stunning, so I kind of wanted to point this out. So as you can see in mathematics, actually, if you look real closely at the total column in 2010, the total column in 2011, we went from 79.8 to 78.8 in performance in third grade. Relatively flat, but I still coded it as red because it was a drop. Same in fourth grade. Fifth grade also, slight increase, but relatively flat. But sixth grade, which I want to remind you was our largest increase in MSA scores last year, took another big jump in FAST 2. I'm really pleased, and you know we're happy about 8th grade because we've really, you know the efforts that we're trying to put around 8th grade mathematics, and that's a nice bump. I have to tell you, I'm a pretty skeptical person, but the anecdotal and the hard data that we're seeing really suggests that we are moving in the right direction across all content areas. There is clearly a synergy in the schools around not just teaching to standards, but principals going back through with their walkthroughs and the collaborative planning and the conversations the teachers are having around instruction. Noticeable difference this year. I just feel like there's a coherence and a synergy around instruction, and I think it's showing in the data. Next slide. You know that our special ed and our ELL populations are most problematic. Where the previous slide, you had to look left to right. This one, you have to look top down. We did drop special ed in 5th grade mathematics, but we had more than 5-point gains in 6th grade and 7th grade. ELL and MOD also had a pretty significant increase, except in 7th grade mathematics, and ELL dropped in 3 areas. At the bottom of the slide, what I've indicated are the actual standards that proved problematic for us. And it's a little bit hard to read on the screen, but you can probably read it on your board docs a little bit easier. And you can see the kinds of standards that the students have struggled with. These are the conversations that teachers are having right now. How do we reteach this? And more importantly, as we move forward, what pedagogy will actually address this? And at the end of the presentation, I'll talk a little bit more about special ed and ELL. This is SRI reading. Now, SRI reading is heavily based on vocabulary, heavily based. So not only is it pretty significant comprehension, but a lot of vocabulary. And it's what I would call a more holistic assessment around reading. Even though the scores have gone up, you have to see that they have not gone up significantly, still relatively flat. And I think what we see here is we see a somewhat of a disconnect between adhering to the voluntary state curriculum around strategies and standards and a more holistic approach. So as we move to Common Core, we're going to talk about deep engagement in text. I think the SRI is actually a better assessment for that than our FAST test in our overall reading ability. We still have a fair amount of work to do in this area. What we have here is reading language arts, and it has all students, then ELL students and special ed students. I'm pretty happy with this data. I'm pretty happy. Look at the greens. And we did have the one drop in special ed in toolkit schools in 4th grade. But for the most part, pretty significant jumps. Now, here's the question we should be asking. Why are the jumps so big here, but not on the previous slide? And again, I think it's that distinction between very specific standards and more holistic reading. I would like to tell you an anecdote, and I don't want to embarrass anybody, because this is really a terrifically awesome teacher. But he was doing a story with 5th grade students around a young lady. It's basically the Paul Revere story. It's a young lady who had anticipated the unrest in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and she actually warned her neighbors that the British were coming. So you get the story. So the standard that he was teaching was main idea, and the story began with Sarah hoped her dreams would not come true, and then it went on to describe the action. The question the teacher asked the kids is, hoping her dream come true, is that important to main idea? And the answer was no. But you all recognize that that was a very important sentence to author's craft and setting the deep understanding of Sarah's frame of mind before this happened. But because it wasn't exactly part of main idea, the teacher discounted it. And this is I'm telling you, this is a terrific teacher. He is terrific. But he is teaching a standards-based approach. We now have to get him to understand that the author's craft of talking about Sarah's state of mind was really very important to understanding this text. And that is a very different switch. Unfortunately, our state assessments and our formative assessments pushed that teacher towards that isolated standard instruction. And that's why I think you see green on this slide and you saw blue on the previous slide. This one is a rubric score on a brief constructed response. And obviously what we want is we want 0s and 1s to decrease, and we want 2s and 3s to increase. In order to get a 2, you need to answer the question completely. In order to get a 3, you must go beyond the text and make connections. So we're real happy to see that we are seeing some increase. But I do give you a warning on brief constructive response. We have to be concerned about iterative reliability and the difficulty of the prompt. I caution us to read too much into this data slide. It's just, I don't have enough brief constructed responses aggregated to give you a real good sense that we're moving in the right direction or in the wrong direction here. It's too narrow of a slice of the pie. On this slide, we are looking at 6th and 7th grade ELL and special ed students. ELL students did drop 1 point in 7th grade and 2.3 points in 8th grade. Special ed students made pretty significant, actually a stunning growth in grade 6. And obviously this is a concern. One of the strategies that we're doing is we are now bringing in the ELL teachers and the special ed teachers in our collaborative conversations around the standard instruction. For too long, they've been isolated from that conversation. And that's actually required some manipulation of the schedule to allow those teachers to participate in those conversations. In this slide, again, I want to caution you, this is a brief constructive response, 6th grade. There also is an error on this slide. Do you see that 1% in the very bottom right-hand corner? That actually should be a 14%. Also, if you add these up, you will notice they do not add up to 100%. These are the number of students who had a test scored divided by the total number of students. So what's not reflected in this data is students whose brief constructive response was not inputted into the chart. Again, be cautious on drawing a conclusion on a single brief constructive response. Now we're moving to HSA. and this is English 2. I have to tell you, you know, we've been really focusing on the assessed areas first-time test takers, and I'm really pleased to see, even that's a modest growth of just 2.8%, I'm really pleased to see that there's a lot of effort here. I think a lot of credit goes to the TCs in the high schools for really taking this on. You did see a pretty big drop in the ELL population. I do have some real concerns about their children's ability to speak English and their ability to read, and then accessing the 10th grade content material. It is proving to be very, very difficult for us. So what we've asked the ELL teachers to do in high school is to actually not only focus on functional English, but actually focus on functional reading, because we feel like they don't simply have the vocabulary to access Shakespeare in 10th grade. Special ed, on the other hand, wow, pretty big jump, almost 10 points. Science, real happy with the science scores. Notice the ELL drop in advanced. What do you have to do to get advanced? Again, it goes back to vocabulary. If you look at our science test, it's extraordinarily vocabulary rich, and it's content vocabulary. So it's vocabulary specific to science. This slide is science. Again, a drop in ELL, I believe, related to vocabulary, but a pretty huge, pretty nice jump for all students in science. Local and state government, huge gains. Now let's speculate as to why I'm optimistic. There is a continued emphasis on data and the analysis of data. All the research indicates that that's the door to improving instruction, and all our anecdotal evidence indicates that school teams are getting much better at looking at their data, and more importantly, going to the next point, what pedagogy is related, what does the data suggest about how we need to do things differently? Weak standards are retaught and practiced, and what you see this year is much more common use of common assessments. What is a common assessment? So when you see a weak standard in the third point, teachers will actually construct a new assessment and administer that assessment until kids get it. And then I think we've done a good job this year of closing the loop. It's not just on the teachers, but it's on our administrators to follow through in the classroom to see if indeed these things are working through. So that's our data. We get data every day. There's some data I haven't shared for you. There's one piece that I just want to tell you about. In 2009, in March, we looked at senior status of the kids who had passed all 4 HSAs. It was 38%. Last year in March, it was 44%. This year, it's 49%. That's pretty consistent growth, and I think it goes to our moving the energy away from the projects and more to let's teach this right the first time. I really have to give a lot of credit to the high school tested areas and the TCs. They have really put a tremendous effort this year, and we're seeing some of that bump. So, questions?
Thank you, Mr. Arbogast. Dr. Arbogast. I have a list here. It's Ms. Boston, Ms. Johnson, Ms. Higgins, Mr. Armwood, and Mr. Harris.
Good evening. How are you today? One of the questions that I have, I'm looking at the your slide, the one with the comparison between America's Choice, the comprehension, and the toolkit.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I do know that America's Choice, at least that's what I think this is the last year for America's Choice. Am I correct in that assumption?
Yeah, it's my understanding that schools can continue with America's Choice, but only with Title I money.
Only with the
There's
Title,
no,
only the
we have
Title
no
I
more ERA carryover funds, and so Title I, America's Choice is becoming more and more diminished.
We have it in 5 of our high schools, too, as a grant match for the Smaller Learning Communities grant.
Okay. Yeah, because I was concerned because it seemed that it was quite a big gain under the America's Choice And if that was to go away, how would that, probably affect us? The second question that I had was, of course, it's obvious that our LEP learners are not progressing as quickly or at the same rate as our other students. What plans do we have? What are you going to propose? What proposals do you have in place to try to correct this gap?
Thank you, Ms. Boston. With America's Choice, I want you to say that even though you don't see the evidence, even though the programs are not funded, when you walk through schools, you're actually seeing a lot of carryover from America's Choice. So a lot of the best practices that were part of America's Choice are still present in schools. So you're still seeing the library books, you're still seeing the accountable talk. So a lot of the best practices still are in place. So if you go into a school like Nicholas Orem, you think, this must be America's Choice school. They're no longer using America's Choice, but a lot of the best practices still remain. So the principals have kind of held on to that piece. The ELL is a challenging population for two reasons: access to English and the ability to read. And they're related, but they're different. And you can't attack just one. You have to attack both. And I think that our ELL curriculum has focused on the first, access to English, but we really understand, particularly at our high school level, access to reading. So we have many children entering 9th grade who are new to our country. Many of these children have had interrupted education, which means they're entering our 9th grade, and sometimes they might be 15, 16, 17 years old, but they've only had 2 or 3 or 4 years of education in their native language. Very difficult to remediate that. So what we're trying to do is not only build that functional English piece, but we're also using our ELL time to build the reading proficiency piece. So that's the first piece. The second piece is we need to include the ELL teachers around standards-based instruction. So I literally asked that question today at Dwight Eisenhower Middle School, because Eisenhower's had a real bump in their scores. All the indicators are moving very well at that school. So I'm trying to figure out what's happening. Their ELL department chair has done a terrific job of using the standards in the regular classroom and making sure the ELL teachers are reinforcing that. So those are strategies that we're using. Is it enough? Well, you saw the data. Most of the red that you saw today was around that specific population. So we still have a lot more work to do.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Boston. Ms. Johnson?
Dr. Arbogast, on slide 5, on slide 5, 2010, using the example of a 5th grader, the 5th grader in 2010, that cohort of students scored 42.9%. Correctly, the 6th grader who had been 5th in 2011 scored 55.4% within that group. Is that how you're looking at that? Or are you matching 5th to 5th, 6th to 6th?
No, we're matching last year's 5th grade to this year's 5th grade.
To this year's?
Yes, ma'am.
4th graders?
No, ma'am.
How are you then using the data that the 5th grade produced as either a predictor of what they should produce in 6th grade or what they in fact have produced in 6th grade based on what you learned about them in 5th grade and each successive grade before and after?
I actually don't have a good answer for you because I don't know the SRI test to its level of how it's equated. So for a test to be equated, you can actually make assumptions from one year to another. And the way you equate tests is you actually embed the same items across grade level tests. I can't tell you at this moment if that's happened with these SRI tests. My hunch is it hasn't, because normally you wouldn't see a jump from 42.9 fifth graders to
11.5 if
yeah,
you did.
I would not draw a conclusion that they made 11 or 13 points growth.
That's why, okay.
No, ma'am.
Then for a different discussion, I mean, it would seem to me that we ought to be able to do what I'm talking about here, because otherwise, how do we begin planning based on what success we know or what we know works? Okay, let me lastly go to the BCRs. first of all, being old teacher, paragraph is still, for me, a BCR. ECR is still an essay. What I am uncomfortable with is that the BCR is so small in its own individual amount that unless students are put to the task of either writing over a week, a month, 2 months, which would be several types, answering a question initially in a paragraph, then continuing the expansion to further expand into a second paragraph, so that by the time you produce, let's say, 5 paragraphs, then you have incorporated, open your statement, give your defense, use your supporting data to wrap up with your conclusion. Or musings on an idea, which allow them to explore creativity, etc., or write specifically for, like, building a defense. You know, I did this, I read this, here is my defense of why my position is here. A BCR, I've read enough of the students' BCRs, I've seen enough of them, and enough teaching about that process. By the time the kid gets going, they're done. And the quality in general, I don't think is really representative of what this student could actually produce, because they don't get enough opportunity to have one paragraph build to the next paragraph that allows the thought to flow. So in doing that, are you all looking at that at all?
Yes, ma'am. And I couldn't agree with you more. A brief constructive response is a very sorry proxy for writing. And I would argue that it's, in fact, not any evidence of writing ability. So I completely agree with you. They are formulaic. They are really, I would actually argue that an overemphasis on brief constructive responses actually delays our writing ability.
Yes, sir.
So I'm completely with you. We have actually written what I'm going to call limited writing prompts, but you would call an essay. We've actually written limited writing prompts to be implemented this year. The state has finally realized that BCRs are not writing and will institute a writing curriculum, which they'll introduce at our summer academies this summer. And I'm asking curriculum instruction to embed limited writing prompts, not BCRs, but limited writing prompts in each of our content areas. And I do want to just, a final point, 2 things I want us to be thinking about. The essays in International Baccalaureate and the DBQs and AP, you know, right, are the standard that we want to go to.
Yes.
And we want a backward map. Now, I don't like the IB rubrics. They're ridiculous. They're just too complex, I think, for teachers to use. Not that teachers can't figure them out. It's just they're unwieldy. But the kind of essays that we're seeing in International Baccalaureate and the DBQs and AP are clearly where we want to be.
Yes, thank you.
Ms. Higgins.
Hi, Dr. Abregaz. Thanks so much for your presentation. These numbers are exciting. Could we look at numbers 5, the 5th slide, please? I think what I want to ask you about is really in reference to the second graders, and is also weaving in the discussion about reading recovery with the fact that we have at second graders, if we have 59%, is that right, that 59% are reading at grade level? Is that a good interpretation of that? Okay, so then that means we have 40% who are not reading at grade level by the end of second grade. So at least that number aren't reading it by the end of first grade, right? So could we talk, right? Yeah. So could we talk a little bit about what number that is and how we can address the reading needs of our students, and how it might fit into the larger picture or the smaller picture with reading recovery?
I actually think it begins in kindergarten.
Kindergarten.
I actually do.
Sure. But we have do we have data for kindergarten, or we started?
I don't.
Second.
But
okay. All right, so
I
kindergarten,
want
go
you,
ahead.
using the language of reading recovery, so imagine levels 1 through 18, with 18 being highly proficient end of first grade. So generally, if a child enters first grade at a level 3, that's considered on grade level.
That's considered what?
On grade level. To first day of first grade,
Okay,
a level 3 is considered on grade level. I get that, but I think that our expectation in kindergarten is probably too low around reading. And I think that we've incrementalized the development of phonemic awareness and phonics. Not that they're bad things, but you know, when you get to, not till January until you get all the way through the alphabet, you've just lost 6 months of actual engagement in text. So I actually think that what we really need to do is we really need to be pushing through a reading curriculum as soon as possible with our kindergarten children. So I don't feel like our first grade teachers are getting kids prepared for more sophisticated reading. So that's the first step. I was talking with the principal of Greenbelt Elementary School, and their kindergarten has actually been honored with some status. And we were talking about how they're actually pushing this engagement in text. There's no reason why kids can't be in reading groups by the 3rd or 4th week of September in kindergarten.
Right.
So that's where it starts. Okay. When we get to first grade, we use the Houghton Mifflin text, which is the text that we use. Now, when you buy a Basel series, any Basel series across the country, they throw everything but the kitchen sink in it. So you'll have a lot of strategies, you'll have phonemic awareness, you'll have the development of phonics, you'll have structural analysis, you'll have comprehension. All the pieces are there. And the teachers then can move through there. And the thinking is that if you go through a Basel reader, you will pick up most kids. And frankly, you're going to get numbers that look like what's up on the screen. But we also have access to level text, and this is the beauty of reading recovery. See, reading recovery absolutely matches where the student is to the text they're working in. So they talk about frustration level, instructional level, and independent level. So instructional level is a very, very narrow range, and that's where reading recovery teachers work. So are level text available in our classrooms? Yes. Can you use a level text in a whole group of 25 students? Absolutely not. That's not the intent. We really have to go to small differentiated groups. Now here's a challenge.
I
Ms.
think
Jacobs?
that's for me,
okay.
not you.
I'm sorry. So here's a challenge for us. If a student is reading below grade level in first grade, we certainly don't want a reading group of 10 or 8. We actually want a small reading group because, again, borrowing from reading recovery, the teacher has to react to every miscue that a student makes. And react to it, they have to diagnose and then prescribe what the reaction would be. So if I could give you an example. So if the sentence says, the boat was on the lake, and the child reads, the boat was on the like, what error did that child make? And most teachers would say, they don't know their vowel sounds. And I would say, they don't understand what they're reading. Do you see? Because nobody would say the boat is on the like. It would be better if the kid said the boat is on the pond, because that would actually make sense.
Right.
Do you see? So a reading recovery teacher gets that. And they would then cue the student on the right question to ask. So our classroom teachers absolutely have to have that kind of a diagnostic prescriptive knowledge, but they can't do it in a whole group. It's got to be in small group. Now, a challenge is, how many small groups can a first grade teacher run? Because the typical first grade teacher could probably easily have 8 groups, which is absurd. You just cannot run a first grade like that. So you have to make concessions in how you build it. And it also goes to how a building principal builds their first grade classrooms. So that's really the challenge. How do we develop the skill to differentiate instruction around how children learn to read in both first and, frankly, second grade? Because second grade teachers aren't off the hook. Because we want our kids reading at or above grade level by the end of second grade. So those kind of strategies absolutely have to be employed. And our building principals have to understand that. So what are we doing about it when we have no money? We actually are trying to figure out ways, low-cost ways, to provide seminar instruction for both our administrators and our teachers. So The SOMARAC conference, which is the Southern Maryland Reading Association, is the best reading conference, and it's cheap, and it's up at Hunt Valley. So we sent a memo out to principals, do whatever it takes to get you and your team to the SOMARAC conference last week in March. And if you guys have an opportunity to go, you will learn more about reading in 2 days than you thought possible. So SOMARAC is the best thinkers in the state of Maryland. The following week, we actually have had people from Johns Hopkins coming, and principals, elementary principals, are encouraged again to bring their teams. And we're actually going to have some national leaders talking about how do kids construct reading, early reading. And that's a free seminar that's actually being provided through the I3 grant at Johns Hopkins University with Success for All. So we would like to continue these kinds of seminars. We also think we can use our Title II money this summer to run our reading seminars for our first and second grade teachers. This was something we had done apparently a couple years ago. Funding kind of ran out. It kind of went by the wayside. That was a huge mistake, and that's why you're seeing this numbers like this. So we have to bring those pieces back, but we have to make sure our principals understand reading and that our teachers have the tools in order to differentiate with level text in support of the basal reader. I apologize for such a long answer.
Thank you. Mr. Armwood?
Thank you. I guess my question is more basic. This morning, riding with my son, he started a conversation where he was saying his kids were complaining, or he was complaining about teaching to the tests. And I see FAST here, and I assume FAST is a test that Prince George's County uses specifically. It's not a state mandated test. At what point do we decide that assessments, which while necessary, become counterproductive? One of the things that my son was complaining about was he would ask the children general knowledge questions, and they do not know it. And when he's asked a teacher in the past, why don't they teach this general knowledge question or specific math function, he's told it's not on the test. And the teachers are being pressured, of course, because of our assessments and, evaluations for teachers to push the achievement for the test. How many tests are we giving, standardized type tests are we giving the children each year now?
There's different kinds of tests.
Okay.
Standardized test is generally, has been standardized across a large population. So an SRI test, like this one up here, is a standardized test. We also give a standardized test for our identification process for TAG students. Mm-hmm. The others are more standards-based or criterion reference test, where you're trying to get to a particular standard. I'm an assessment guy. I believe in assessment, but I believe the point that you're bringing is you're really referencing weak assessments or poor assessments. Quality assessments actually allow students different ways to respond to a problem, and they get kids to think. What I think you're referring to is really a deficit in our ability. I'm not talking about Prince George's County Public Schools, but I'm talking about the United States of America. Our ability to generate a quick score as opposed to really assessing how kids think and learn. And I'm optimistic that this movement to Common Core, there are two huge consortiums working on assessments. PARC, which is the one that Maryland belongs to, and there's another group called SMARTER, that both of them are charged with creating much more viable and authentic assessment. For example, like a performance assessment. The challenge of performance assessment is it's much more expensive to build, much more expensive to score. And Ms. Johnson spoke earlier about moving towards VCRs. We used to have essays on our tests, and they were removed off the high school assessments because they were too expensive and it took too much time to score them. So we've made all these concessions in the name of efficiency that have produced the culture that you're talking about. I'm completely okay with teaching to the test if the test is a good test.
One of the things that Ms. Johnson's point triggered in me, there's no flow in a child's education is the way it appears to me. There's no building on the knowledge. You complete your assessments, you graduate 5th grade, you go into a new series of assessments, and there's no flow or continuity in what we're building. That's the way it appears to me. That's not the way it should be. So how do you address that, and how do we start changing this culture we're talking about that's promoting assessments being what is taught in classrooms?
Our curriculum people would argue that, in fact, our standards are cycled through within a grade and across grades.
I just want to interrupt one thing. Yeah. You were not able, when Ms. Johnson asked a question about what is the progress made for the same student from 5th to 6th, you're unable to answer that.
No, actually, I can't answer it with this test because it's not equated. But when it comes to curriculum, our curriculum people would argue that it is cyclical. But again, we're a victim of what I would call incrementalization, that we're looking at such isolated skills that, in fact, don't show up well on this SRI test and don't go to the kind of thinking and learning that the people around this room value. That we've built this ship ourselves, not Prince George's County, but this country and this state have built these very incremental tests. So the teachers, there's so much accountability right now. The teachers will get these fast tests and they think, I must cut out my kidney in order to teach the skills on this test. And we've created that culture. So you're absolutely right. If we have better assessments that are more holistic and more performance-based, you will see that growth across grade levels. And I think it goes closer to address it. I'm optimistic that where we are going, Common Core will take us there, but we're not there today, sir.
What changes in policy would accomplish that?
Well, the adoption of the Common Core. And as soon as you change the state test, everybody follows suit. So 10 years ago, Maryland was a leader in assessment. And you recall MSPAP? Do you guys remember that? That had some real weaknesses as far as linking student performance, individual student performance. But the actual task in MSPAP were some of the most stunning assessments in the country. And frankly, Maryland and Kentucky were the leaders at the time. And all of that was abandoned in 2003 with the institution of MSA.
Mr. Harris.
I agree with Ms. Higgins in that this data is exciting. I do know that we did have a lot of red on there. But could you please go to slide page 3? And I know we had a lot of talk, and Dr. Heiss said that he told, and yourself, Dr. Arbogast, scrapped the Algebra 1, 8th grade, and I believe 7th grade math curriculums last year.
Yes, sir. We rewrote it, and actually we were not getting good results in a course called ADA, and what ADA was designed to do was to get kids to pass the HSA, but not necessarily to learn algebra in its depth. So we kind of scrapped that, and we actually instituted a book called The Big Ideas in 8th grade, and we were real optimistic about this book, and I think that's why you're seeing that score go up. The Big Ideas goes back to Mr. Armwood's. It's actually putting discrete skills together so that it makes a little bit more sense. So we think we're getting a pretty good payoff on that. So yes, you are correct. And you know I'm happy with that 64.9. You know that.
Yeah, so actually, you just hit the point. In statistics, I just learned about significance tests. And I really want to see at the end of the year, can we, first for all the statistics students, but I also want to see, can we, do a significance test to test to see if actually the book that we bought or that the rewriting the curriculum is actually the reason why the scores went up, or is it due to other variables. So that's one of the things I wanted to see. Because when I look at this data, I think, wow, man, if we had this in my statistics class, because one of the things I always think about is we don't do a lot, at least in the classes I've been in, we haven't done a lot of taking what we've learned and actually really applying it to life or applying it to real data. And I take this as an opportunity to really apply data and actually see how we can take what we've learned in class and apply it to real life. And just to add to the conversation of teaching to the test, I haven't really been a victim, I guess you can say, of that a lot. I actually find that in my AP classes that I take, we still have a test to take at the end of the year, but I really don't feel, and even in my biology HSA class, I really didn't feel like my teacher was just teaching me to the test. And I also found that I could actually, just the way he taught the class was, just the way he taught the class was like a view. You know, it wasn't just straightforward. I could apply it to different things. I can think outside the box. So I really want to see, is there a way you can compare it to what the College Board does with their tests? Or do you see any flaws in the way the College Board does their curriculum for APs? Can you just speak to that for a minute?
We're actually investing pretty heavily in the AP and have for quite some time. And you know we're using our Race to the Top for this AP diagnostic, where we're actually looking at not only our AP courses, but the pipeline courses. So, Mr. Harris, yeah, I'm a fan of AP. It's pretty content-rich, but I actually think we need to be there. I think the writing that's demanded in AP is really exactly the kind of thinking that we want. And we also know that success in AP translates to success in college. So, no, I'm with you on that. We can run this significant studies. One thing I want to warn you about, though, in MSA and HSA, remember it's scaled score points. It's not necessarily a linear scale. So you could get, one child could get the same number of questions as another child, same number right, but the one child will have a much higher score because he got more difficult questions. So we can, what I would like to do is actually run the scaled score on MSA for 8th grade and then compare it, and then we'll do a significance test. And as you know, as long as the N is good, then we should feel confident.
And the last thing was, I think when we talk about changing the culture, at a young age, I wish that I knew just the way the school system worked or the way teaching worked, as in, okay, so I learned how my alphabets here. I learned my alphabets, then the alphabets, you know, go into words. And then when I moved on to 2nd grade, you know, I know you learn sentences, you know, I just want to use that as an example. I know you learn sentences in kindergarten, but in 2nd grade, then really we're just building upon that base. And I think if we explain that to students a little bit more, I think it would truly help, because I'm just realizing how, you know, something that, you know, what I learned in 5th grade, all they were doing was just adding on different aspects. You know, you have a car or you have an engine, and then every year you're adding on the window shields, you're adding on the lights, you know, to build up to this knowledge base. I feel if we do that a little bit more, it will really help students understand why they are in school. And I know I just ran out of time. I just want to add in again, just making sure that our curriculum really helps students understand how we're going to apply this to life. What's the bigger picture? Because a lot of us, we're just looking straight forward. But if we looked at, okay, there's more than just straightforward, it's something over here, it's something over here we can look at also, it will really help us out.
Thank you. Ms. Beck? Oh, Dr. Hyde, did you
Yeah,
want
well said, Mr. Harris. And as you heard Dr. Albergas talk about the Common Core. And in the Common Core, something that he just talked about, and as you were talking and describing your experience, I just thought about the distinction between where we are now and where we are likely to be with respect to the Common Core. And he talked about the big idea. And this big idea, which you just described, something that you learn as soon as you enter school, and how that will apply as a knowledge or a skill before you graduate, or in the term of your educational experience. So part of the Common Core now suggests, or it doesn't suggest, it contains these big ideas. And the distinction is, every year now, there are discrete content items that we have to teach to students. And they just add on. And they're not really connected or integrated or aligned. They're just add-ons. And students can't, in some cases, don't make any sense of why that's so and why is it so now. And with the new Common Core, the main ideas or the big ideas that a 12th grader will need are the same that a 3rd grader will need, because it's around those life skills, as you just described, problem solving, critical thinking, and how these things become a part of that. The other part of this conversation is the whole writing. It is, and I've talked about this before, writing has become a different component and a different experience for our students. And I want to use an example that was shared with me by my colleague who is, that I talk to regularly because we have students at his school. And he is Dr. Freeman Rabowski at UMBC. And Dr. Rabowski talks about our students and their math knowledge and their science knowledge. And he compares it to students who are coming from all over the world to come into his program. And he says, what's interesting or interesting distinction is when some of the students have to actually explain how they arrived at this outcome or that project, or talk about what they were attempting to accomplish. And that really speaks to a student's ability to communicate that knowledge in a different way, and primarily in writing. And he says what that suggests is that we should have more reading that's a part of the student's experience, and a lot more writing that's a part of the student's experience, because the writing actually performs the foundation for good communication.
And I'll just add, talking to a good friend who is a content expert, she said that children need to be engaged 100 minutes a week in argument. And we said, oh, that's not a problem. No, she said, not that kind of argument. That if you think about your week this week, Mr. Harris, how many minutes this week were you engaged in supporting an argument using evidence? That, if you think about it that way, there are very few minutes in our kids' day that it's where you're actually having to support, and, as Dr. Height said, not just with your mouth, but it has to come out of your pencil. It's got to be in the writing piece.
Ms. Beck?
Can we go to slide 4, just so that I'm trying to understand how to read this. If I'm looking at the LEP in 2009-2010, 76.8. So the following year, that same group of children would be the 77.3. Okay.
No. Last year's third grade scored 76.8. This year's third grade scored 77.7. It's a different cohort of children.
Okay, so it's not moving like you see.
It actually moves diagonally.
Right.
Yeah.
Except that it's not equated. So I have no faith in making that conclusion unless I'm sure that the test has been equated. And in order to be equated, that means the fourth grade test would have to contain some of the same items as the third grade test. That's how a normed reference test is built. And that's how you can actually say this kid actually grew from one year to the next. These tests are not constructed with a growth model in mind. That's a much more sophisticated test.
So there's no way to track the child or the cohort's progression?
There are ways, but not with this measure. What Mr. Armwood said much earlier, are we testing too much? So we're very sensitive to this idea of testing. But there are actually several assessments that would actually give us that, and there are computer-adapted tests, which are very clean and very easy to give, that actually give you a pretty good sense of growth and value added. They do have a downside. This test is much better to diagnose what I need to teach tomorrow than these other computer-adapted tests. So for every assessment you use, there's a cost and a benefit. And this test doesn't do all, and I could find another test that did what you're suggesting, but it wouldn't have the diagnostic prescriptive that this has.
Okay. Because when I first saw that, without that explanation, I naturally went diagonally. Okay, my other question goes to middle school science, which is page 12. That looks, I'm going to say 8th grade, looks, what's the word, anemic? Because if that's proficient and advanced, then 62% in all students grade 8 are not.
Yes, ma'am, and that's very consistent with our performance on MSA Science.
And so the 8th grade kids then go into biology HSA.
2 years later.
2 years later. And that's why the HSA scores look low. The first round of FAST 2, 34%. So the relationship between middle school science carries on to biology HSAs.
If you look at the MSA Science in 5th and 8th grade, extraordinarily heavily biased towards vocabulary-driven concepts, and they are very, very difficult tests. But your point is absolutely spot on, that this is an area that we actually need to increase. But you'll notice science is not part of AYP. So where has our attention been? Our attention's been around accountability. And what subjects have gotten less attention? The non-assessed areas. So now science is assessed, but we don't have the corresponding accountability with that. And we're just now understanding how much energy needs to go to science. Have you been informed yet that we're not giving the HSA government next year?
Oh, yeah.
You know that, right? We're real concerned about that, because when you move accountability off of exams, suddenly it loses its interest. And frankly, if you're a building principal and you're really worried about reading and math, what subject are you going to shortchange? So we recognize this, and you're absolutely right that our kids in 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th need engagement in, as Dr. Height said, content-specific reading that is rich in the discipline's vocabulary. So kids have to know words like nucleus. They have to know that in order to do well on this test, and you're right, eventually to do well on the biology test. You know you can take the biology test, a sample biology test on MDK-12. You guys should take it.
I'm not emotionally sound enough to do that.
MDK12.org, and there are actually sample tests. Take the 4 HSA tests, the biology test. If you don't know the difference between tRNA and mRNA, and that's all I'm going to say about that.
I already surrender. My final question relates to our youngest kids, because in all of this data, the only data I saw for grade 2 was the Scholastic Reading Inventory. So we don't test, or we don't have any assessments when kids first come in, so that we can, I know there was was a news report about you could really tell kids in kindergarten who are not going to be able to read right away. Are we able to assess children when they come into kindergarten and say these are the ones who are going to struggle the worst?
Yes, ma'am. And there's a couple ways to do it, and we are doing actually a lot of assessment in K&1, but we're not doing broad-based electronic scanning, so it's harder to aggregate the data. It becomes much more laborious for teachers. So if you ask reading recovery teachers, I can show you a lot of data that's all been hand-entered into Excel spreadsheets. We're also piloting a directed reading activity, a diagnostic reading activity in grade 1, and I'm trusting the data that I'm seeing. Also, if you recall when I talked about leveled text, teachers actually keep track. That's what reading recovery teachers do. They actually keep track of the levels. And as a building principal, what I would do is I actually knew where every kindergarten and every first grade teacher, every kid was every 2 weeks. And I could say, you know, you're a level 7 in January. I'm okay with that. I'm not okay with a level 3. I'm really happy with a level 12. So, but that data is, it's hard for me to pull up and aggregate because it's just too laborious to do it electronically.
But we are we are evaluating students.
Yes, ma'am. I would,
so that they don't get into second grade.
Our teachers are assessing every day. However, this is what I'm not convinced, and this is why I think our scores are a little bit flat. I'm not convinced that we're doing the small group, student to teacher, on a daily basis that needs to happen. And if I walk into a first grade class and I see the teacher standing in front of the class, then I know it's not happening, because it can't happen that way. It's got to happen. This is a shoulder to shoulder, and or at least small group table. And that's what reading teachers, reading recovery teachers, and intervention teachers are collecting pretty good data. We're actually collecting some electronic data around our interventions, kids who are struggling. But no, I think every principal needs to know where every K and 1 and 2 kid is on a level text.
Right. Thank you.
Mr. Burrows?
I'm also very excited about the data, and I hope that we'll be able to communicate that with the public in our communications office. I would like to see a campaign to push, the good news that we do have. I just wanted to start off with saying that, so I'm just going to use my little brother as an example. He's in 3rd grade now. He's struggling in reading. He's a lot better because he was in a reading recovery program, but he's not where he needs to be. And so we got the report card, and we saw he was struggling in reading. And so Mom had a conversation with the teacher, and teachers have to move on. You have a curriculum every year. You can't hold back or adjust the way I think you should be able to do. I'm fearful that because we move on at such a fast pace each year, regardless if the student is where they need to be, they only get further and further behind as time goes on. And like Dr. Height said, you know, I talk to Dr. Bowski all the time, and if you can't read, I mean, reading, you know, you can't do anything else. You know, it'll be, you can't do anything else if you cannot read. And in elementary school, if you're continually progressing because of the curriculum is forcing you to, you know, move forward, but, you know, your reading isn't progressing, I mean, you're not really being, I don't consider that being a successful student. So I just wanted you to address that. And also, I think it would be helpful, a lot of information is lost in the transition between grades. For example, if I would like to see a system where if I'm a first grade teacher, I'll be able to maybe log in School Max, a student profile. This is where the student, I know we have test scores and data and that sort of thing, but something that's a little bit more genuine, something like, okay, this is what works for this student, this is what has not worked for me, this is some things that, you know, some strategies here that he or she responds to. And I feel like that document can be passed on from kindergarten, first grade, second grade, third, you know, on out until, you know, they graduate. And I went to the charter school on Brown Station Road, and they actually have 1 day a week or 2 days a week or some type of setup where they're in small groups. Well, some students are in a small group, some students are doing a reading activity on a computer, and some students are doing a reading activity independently. And maybe that's a way we can, you know, it's tough for a first grade teacher to manage 6 different reading groups, but maybe that's the way that we can spread it out. And also you mentioned that there's a seminar coming up, reading seminar coming up in the March. And, you know, I believe if your school is not where it needs to be in reading, I think we should be doing, I think we should possibly mandate that the principals send their teams there, not encourage. I mean, if you need the additional support, we need to say you need to be there.
When it comes to reading, think about 4 groups. There are the group of kids who learn to read by magic. They learn to read by just walking by a book. And then there's a group of kids who respond to our typical everyday instruction, and they learn to read that way. Then there's 2 more groups of kids. There's a group of kids who absolutely just need to practice it over and over and over again. And then there's a group of kids who actually need a completely different way to view the world. The interventions take care of that, well, they address that bottom group. But I don't think our kids read enough. So my question to your brother is, how many minutes a day is he engaged in reading? And these are the kinds of reading. Reading within his instructional level and someone reading to him. And as you add up those minutes, you'll actually see improvement. What's exciting about reading, the good news about reading is the learning curve is very steep in the early grades, but it really flattens out. So you can be a struggling reader in early grades and still become a proficient reader, but you got to work it. And I'm not sure our school day is really structured to give kids a lot of opportunities to read. So that's kind of my first response to that piece. You talked about transition between grades. You know, you've heard of looping. There's a lot of research that supports looping. When a teacher follows a cohort of kids from one grade to the next, they're finding the month of September to be incredibly efficient in situations where looping occurs. And that is occurring episodically in Prince George's County Public Schools. We also know that the summer months are deadly, that affluent household kids do not lose, they don't they don't get better, but they don't lose. But kids in poverty actually have a pretty big dip from the end of June to the beginning of September. We have not structured ourselves to address that. And you know, with the budget, summer school is difficult, and I'm not sure that summer school was enough to address that transition piece. The other piece is, so we probably, if we were really serious about this, we'd probably look at a year-round schedules, really looking at how long a break should be in order to maximize the carryover. We also have to be much better at our diagnostic work first days of school, so we know exactly where to start, and not just say, oh, the curriculum says we need to be here. We need to say, what does the diagnostic test see? We need to be here. And your last piece is you just described reading groups, 3-group rotation, and that's a really powerful strategy in order to get face time with small groups. But I want you to know, for every minute a teacher is engaged with a group of students, those are very powerful minutes. The other students, perhaps those minutes aren't quite as powerful, but they don't have to be unproductive.
Right.
You know, so really that's a classroom management strategy. And if you're a first-year teacher, it's hard to pull off multiple group rotations. You know, skilled teachers are quite good at it.
And just to agree with Ms. Johnson and Mr. Harris with writing, you know, I don't remember having to write a thesis in my entire experience. Honestly, I don't ever remember. I remember doing ECRs and the different formulas like TIC, you know, topic, inference. You know, I know the formulas and that sort of thing, but I've never really had to write a thesis, defend it. I never had to engage in that. Well, I mean, I had to write an essay, but it wasn't as structured and as clear as what I have to do now that I'm in college.
Your brother will be so much better prepared.
Thank you. And you said there were 4 groups of readers? My parents have 4 kids, and one in each group. And I'm not the one that can read magically.
Just one, I just want to add one additional thing, Mr. Burrows, and I think it's also, we have to really begin thinking about text complexity as well. And we tend to want to, we tend to want to move toward those things that are easier to do when now you know and you're experiencing what you're being asked to read in college. And the complexity of text then becomes very important. And in the age of everything being easy and at your fingertips and cute, we have to really also focus on more complex text, especially as we are preparing students for the workplace or for college.
Absolutely. In my first meeting with Dr. Hrabowski, he gave me 4 books to read.
That is the end of round 1, and on round 2, we have Ms. Higgins.
Great, thank you very much. How many students do you estimate that are not able to read at grade level at the end of first grade?
Just on speculation, I'm thinking that 40% is probably pretty accurate.
Which would be what number?
Well, if you figure we have about 9,500, let's round it off to 10,000. So 40.
So about 4,000 students.
Yeah, a little less, but.
All right. And so when you talk about, you talked earlier about really working with principals and teachers. Is it a question of starting at ground zero, or is it a question of enhancing the skills? I mean, are we developing these skills, or they don't have these skills, or we're really fine-tuning them? Where are we on the continuum?
I think our professionals run across the continuum. There are people that work in this county who know more about reading than anyone on the planet.
Okay.
And then there are people, I'm most concerned about our youngsters who are young professionals who have only seen this incrementalized, this parsing of reading skills and strategies that has been driven by the test. So I'm a little bit concerned about that group and how intensive our professional development has been. So when we look at that SRI data, which I think is really important, I don't remember what slide it was. I actually think that that's that holistic view of reading, and that's we really have to get teachers and principals to understand that that's really what it's about.
Okay.
You still can teach to discrete skills, but if you're not putting it all together.
Let me jump in, because I only
Sure.
got 3 minutes. So that being said, it sounds like you're already moving to address those possible deficiencies that we have within our system.
Yes, ma'am.
Whether or not we are able to restore some of the money or whatever.
Yes, ma'am.
And then the increased percentage in the results that we saw, do you think that's plateaued, or we have reason to believe that those percentages will continue? Those, the positive numbers.
I think that the actions that the principals and teachers have made in the past year or so have paid dividends and will continue to pay dividends. But you'll get to points where it's very, very difficult to move scores. So at our highest performing schools, it's really hard to move their numbers.
Yes.
Unless we change our assessments, and the assessments can become more sophisticated. I did want to make one more comment about your earlier point.
I'm done with my questions, so you can have my
There's an assessment called DIBELS. And DIBELS was developed by the University of Oregon, and it can be given in kindergarten and first grade and second grade. And what DIBELS does is DIBELS is a series of tasks that a child does, and it's actually correlated to reading, but it is not reading. It just happens to be, it's like nonsense syllables, it's the recognition of initial sounds, it's all these discrete skills. But what they found at the University of Oregon is that how kids do on DIBELS actually is a predictor for later reading. It's fascinating. So I actually spent a fair amount of time looking at DIBELS data, and what I found was there was no achievement gap in my previous district in pre-K and in K on DIBELS, that student groups were actually working at about the same level, and the split occurred mid-first grade. And you might say, what happens at mid-first grade? Well, that's where you have to put it all together to read text. That there's not enough picture clues, it is not controlled vocabulary. By mid-first grade, you have to put the whole game together. And that's where, using DIBELS data, I was actually able to see how those who could read and those who can't. And it's kind of interesting. And then the other data piece that was fascinating is words per minute. Words per minute sounds like a silly metric, but it's actually an incredible predictor of a student's ability to comprehend text. So the number of words you can read per minute, I know it sounds counterintuitive, but the number of words you can read per minute is actually a predictor of your comprehension of the text. So that's, Mr. Burrows, that goes back to your practicing reading, and that's what we call fluency. So by actually increasing your fluency, the corollary is comprehension magically increases.
Thank you.
Ms. Johnson.
Dr. Arbogast, we've spent, hour, 2 hours talking about the different tests, et cetera. I just have some pretty broad-based questions. I don't necessarily expect an answer today, but I clearly want a response over time. We've got to get there. One, where is the R&D in PGCPS, research and development, in terms of developing diagnostic tools that give us the best information on, one, how and how much children are learning and when they're learning it, and what skills do we know they must acquire, when they ought to acquire it, so that they can learn more high-level advanced skills for going to the next level. And lastly, with all these silos of information, these different tests and measurements and benchmarks are given us, what are we doing to put all that together to tell us if we're doing this right? I mean, we are just amassing mounds and mounds of data. We're putting children through all these benchmarks. We're putting teachers through all of these in-services. But I've been here a long time, and I will tell you, I don't know that we are any further along in building the profile of a student that Dr. Haidt has been talking about, because none of this information is cross-referenced to tell us. And so where's our research and development? If we're not doing it, who is doing it, and can we get it here? Something has to happen. We cannot keep striding this worn path of putting teachers through in service of continually talking about this test, that benchmark. If it doesn't produce results, it's a waste of money, it is a waste of time, and it's exhausting teachers and children. And so I'd like to know, what have we learned, and are we employing it?
And you don't need an answer today? Thank you.
Seeing no other speakers, thank you, Dr. Arbogast. We really appreciate it. And I want to add one thing that Mr. Harris said, is throughout the whole discussion, the one piece we kept missing was the engagement of parents and how we are part of the puzzle, and the other part is preparing the child at home. And just imagine where we could be if every day a child went home and had a little bit of reading time. And so I just wanted to make sure Mr. Harris's point got out there. Ms. Jacobs had a family emergency. She hopes to be back, but she'll be gone for a brief period of time. We are now at 7.0, the consent agenda. So I will yield to Dr. Height for introduction to the consent agenda.
Thank you, Ms. Hathaway Beck. And the consent agenda items, items 7.1 to 7.10, and these are all items that were discussed at our CIP FAB meeting a couple of weeks ago. So I submit these items to you for approval.
Looking for a motion to approve items 7.1 to 7.10.
So moved. Second.
Properly moved and seconded that the Board of Education approves items 7.1 to 7.10 under the consent agenda. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, Ms. LeBon, please call the roll.
Mr. Armwood?
Aye.
Ms. Boston?
Aye.
Mr. Burrows?
Aye.
Ms. Higgins?
Aye.
Ms. Johnson? Ms. Waller?
Aye.
Mr. Harris? Ms. Hathaway Beck?
Aye.
Motion carried.
Now yield the floor to Dr. Height for introduction of the emergency item 8.1.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And item 8.1 is submitted as an emergency, and this is refreshing the local area network infrastructure in our 80% and 90% E-rate discounted schools. And the reason that this is coming before we're submitting this as an emergency is because in the event that we receive E-rate funds, we must have these schools in our refresh program identified by the end of March. And so we have to have this done by March 30th, and considering that there is not another, we have a meeting on the 24th, but we have, it's not the end of March, it's by March 15th?
No, Dr. Height, it is March 24th is the deadline to submit this information, and since our board meeting falls on that same day, we wanted to make sure that we brought this forward. So in the event that our application is approved, we would be eligible to receive funds from E-rate to do 90% of this work. So this contract, we would pay approximately 10 to 15% of that contract in the event that this was done.
I would also add, Madam Chair, that we had a technology refresh amount in last year's budget, and the bulk of this would be through technology refresh, and the difference, that up to 10% would be covered in the event E-rate funds are released. And without E-rate funds being released, we could not move forward with this work.
Okay, colleagues. Do we have any discussion? Can I get a little bit more clarification on the budget implication, the $0.7 million. Is that, describe that one more time for me.
This is to complete the local area networks, and they are identified in our E-rate program as appropriate expenditure, so that we could make the local area or build local area networks where we are creating wireless networks inside of our schools. And this amount is based on the utilization of the E-rate funds to cover the difference between what we would spend on this and what E-rate would cover.
Okay. Okay, may I have a motion to approve item 8.1?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
Mr. Armwood. Properly moved and seconded that the Board of Education approves item 8.1 listed as an emergency item. Hearing no other discussion, Ms. LeBon, please call the roll.
Mr. Armwood?
Aye.
Ms. Boston?
Aye.
Mr. Burrows?
Aye.
Ms. Higgins?
Aye.
Ms. Johnson? Ms. Waller?
Aye.
Mr. Harris? Ms. Hathaway Beck?
Aye.
Motion carried.
We are now at item 9.1, Revised Board Policy 9360. We have had our speaker, Mr. Khan, on that. We are now at the point of accepting item 9.1 under new business as a first reader. Do we have a motion? Second? It's been properly moved and seconded that the Board of Education accepts item number 9.1 under new business as a first reader. Is there any discussion? Which we usually don't have on first readers. All those in favor signify by saying aye. So moved. And we'll wait to hear or receive the written comments from Mr. Khan as he spoke. We have 4 registered speakers that will speak on items, non-agenda items. Our first speaker is the Reverend Dolores M. Roberts, individual, who will speak on violence in the schools. Please come forward.
Good afternoon. I want to acknowledge Dr. Height and to the board and ladies and gentlemen that are present. My name is Dolores M. Roberts, and I stand this afternoon as a change agent, an advocate, and a voice for the young people in Prince George's County Schools. I am here as a voice for the students who are afraid to speak out and speak up about the violence and violent activity that are taking place in their schools. I first learned about the violence in the schools in 2007 at a meeting with Congressman Wynn, Education Advisory Committee. And I learned it from a teacher who was talking about violence inside the schools. And at that point, I decided that I need to be a party of one to go all over Prince George's County in the malls and in all of the libraries, parks, wherever I saw teens, I would ask them about the violence in their schools. And the things that the teens discussed and shared with me was so appalling that I was just really sick to know that those kinds of things was going on with the bullying, the sex, the drugs, gangs, gang initiation, alcohol, bullying. The list goes on and on. I have a list for all of you of all the things. I have 45 items, things that's going on in the school, teachers being choked, knocked unconscious, disrespecting teachers. Just, I witnessed some of the things that I witnessed. I even had 2 kids told me about a rape in a school, in a high school and middle school. Kids, I'm asking them about telling. Why don't you tell? Well, I'm not a snitch. If I am the snitch, before the year's out, I will be. I have to fight. Kids who say they have to bring weapons to school in their book bags and knives, and I had a parent to tell me that one child their child, unbeknown to him, brought a knife to school to protect himself from a bully. As late as 2 nights ago at a PTA meeting, a parent told me that she's thinking about getting a lawyer because her son is constantly being bullied, beat up on the bus, just all kinds of things. And I came before the school board 2 years ago, almost to the day, and I have not gotten any kind of response from the school board. So I'm here a second time telling you that it is an epidemic. You name any office, I've been there. From Rashawn Baker's office, that's now, it used to be Jack Johnson. I went to Alsabrook. I haven't been to Alsabrook, but it was Glenn Ivy's office.
Thank you, Reverend Roberts. Could we ask you to transfer your comments into writing so that we can follow up directly with you? And thank you. You will receive a response from that. Leave that with Ms. McCauley.
And I did that the last time.
We will assure you you will receive a response. Thank you for your comments.
Well, I joined forces with...
Thank you, Ms. Reverend Roberts. We have a 3-minute time limit.
Oh.
We appreciate you coming to speak with us. We will follow up with you. Appreciate your advocacy in the county. I'm sure Dr. Height and his team will be responsive. Apologize for not communication last time. Thank you. Our next speaker is Bridget O'Neill, individual speaking on bereavement services and other programs offered in Prince George's County. Not seeing Ms. O'Neill. Nicole Smith, individual on transportation issues. Megan Allen, individual on the Green Initiative, Power Shift 2011. No, thank you. Okay, colleagues, we are at agenda item 11.1, follow-up items from the February 24th, 2011 board meeting. Are there any questions or comments regarding the follow-up items and responses? If you have any questions with them. No questions. Okay, thank you. Agenda item 12.1, motion to confirm actions taken in executive session. May I have a motion to confirm actions taken in executive session on Thursday, March 10th, 2011?
So moved. Madam Chair, we haven't completed executive session yet. We have to go back into it.
We are going back. We will return to take our motion to confirm items after we return from executive session. Let's have a motion to adjourn back into executive session.
I make a motion that we adjourn back to executive session.
Second.
May I have a voice? All in favor? Thank you.